The roar of engines, the thunder of marching boots, and the flash of missiles rolling across Tiananmen Square announced to the world that China was no longer hiding its ambitions. The Grand Parade in Beijing wasn't just a spectacle of national pride, it was a declaration of power, a warning wrapped in pageantry. Towering above the crowds and the lines of disciplined soldiers were the stars of the show. New intercontinental ballistic missiles, stealth bombers, hypersonic weapons, and drone systems advanced enough to terrify seasoned analysts. Among them, the DF-61 missile captured global attention. With a range of over 12,000 kilometers, it could strike anywhere in the continental United States, challenging the long-held assumption that America's homeland was untouchable. But if the weapons themselves sent one kind of message, the company standing beside China's leader sent another. Xi Jinping was flanked by Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, two figures often branded as adversaries of the West. Their presence transformed the event from a national military celebration into a show of international defiance. The visual was too powerful to dismiss. The leaders of China, Russia, and North Korea smiling together as weapons capable of altering the global balance of power rolled by. It was the kind of image that could not be ignored in Washington and certainly not by Donald Trump. Within hours of the parade, Trump took to his platform, Truth Social, and fired off a response that immediately ricocheted across headlines. Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America. The post, heavy with sarcasm, was more than a jab at Xi, Putin, and Kim. It was an accusation that what unfolded in Beijing wasn't just symbolism. It was collusion, an emerging coalition of authoritarian powers aligning themselves against the U.S. For Trump, the optics were simple. America was under siege and its enemies were no longer subtle about it. His words touched a nerve. For his supporters, this was the kind of blunt truth they wanted from leadership. A willingness to call out adversaries without the polished language of diplomacy. For critics, it was reckless, inflaming tensions at a time when the world was already fragile. But whether loved or hated, Trump's remarks set the tone for how millions of Americans interpreted the parade, not as a neutral commemoration of World War II, but as a signal of hostility. The fact that Trump connected the parade directly to U.S. history was not accidental. In follow-up remarks, he reminded the world that the United States had been critical in defeating Japan during World War II and had provided immense sacrifices, both in blood and in resources, to secure China's future. To Trump, Xi's parade wasn't just about pride in China's past, it was a betrayal of the very nation that once bled for its freedom. This framing appealed to American nationalism, reinforcing the idea that the U.S. was not just another player on the global stage but the nation that had shaped the 20th century order. And now, in Trump's view, that order was being undermined by those who owed America a debt of gratitude. Meanwhile, the details of the weapons themselves fed a growing unease. The DF-61 wasn't the only threat. Analysts zeroed in on China's hypersonic glide vehicles, capable of speeds above Mach 5 and unpredictable maneuvers that render traditional missile defense systems almost useless. The JL-3 submarine-launched ballistic missile, showcased for the first time, suggested that China could now maintain a credible second strike capability, meaning even if their land-based missiles were destroyed, submarines could retaliate. Stealth aircraft and AI-driven armored vehicles rounded out the display, blurring the line between science fiction and reality. To the casual observer, it was breathtaking. To defense planners, it was chilling. In the United States, political responses began to diverge. The Biden administration downplayed the parade, stressing that while China's growing military was concerning, the U.S. still maintained global superiority in both nuclear and conventional forces. Officials emphasized diplomacy and the importance of keeping communication lines open. Yet Trump's framing of the event as an open conspiracy caught fire in media circles. It didn't matter whether one agreed with him. The imagery of Xi, Putin, and Kim together, combined with the showcasing of weapons that could hit U.S. soil, was powerful. Trump knew it and he capitalized on it. The strategic timing of the parade also mattered. Coming amid ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and rising tensions over Taiwan, the spectacle felt less like a commemoration and more like a challenge. By placing Putin and Kim in prominent seats, Xi underscored China's role as the central figure in a bloc that appeared increasingly comfortable defying the West. This was not the Cold War where rival powers were loosely connected. This was more visible, more direct, and arguably more dangerous. Trump's accusation of conspiracy tapped into that fear. And yet, beneath the rhetoric and the spectacle, questions lingered. How much of the parade reflected real capability, and how much was theater? Military analysts have long warned that parades can exaggerate strength. Some of the weapons displayed may not be fully operational, and some may exist only in prototype numbers. But even if half of what was shown was real, it was enough to signal that the balance of power in the Pacific, and perhaps the world, was shifting. For Trump, that was the crux of the matter. Whether exaggerated or not, the message was clear. America was being targeted. As commentators debated, the American public grappled with growing anxiety. For decades, the U.S. homeland had felt secure. Wars happened overseas, battles played out in distant deserts or jungles, but American cities remained untouched. The DF-61 changed that perception. Suddenly, the idea of Washington, New York, or Los Angeles being within reach of Chinese missiles was not just a theoretical nightmare but a concrete possibility. Trump's blunt assertion of conspiracy fit neatly into this fear, presenting a narrative of betrayal and urgency. By the end of the first week after the parade, the story had taken on a life of its own. News outlets dissected every detail of the weapons, every nuance of Trump's statement, and every implication of the Xi-Putin-Kim trio. Analysts debated whether the U.S. was witnessing the birth of a new military alliance or merely a symbolic show of solidarity. But to Trump and his supporters, the answer was obvious. America was being conspired against, and only strong leadership could confront it. The parade was over, the weapons had been rolled back into their silos and hangars, but the political and psychological impact remained. The world had been shown a vision of China's future. One in which it was no longer content to be a regional power but was positioning itself as a global challenger. Trump's reaction ensured that, at least in the United States, this vision would not be seen as neutral. It would be seen as hostile. And with that framing, the stage was set for the next chapter of this unfolding geopolitical drama. While China's parade was intended to impress its domestic audience and signal strength abroad, in the United States, the event was immediately consumed by partisan battles. The question of how America should respond became the latest flashpoint in an already polarized political climate. Donald Trump's response was as forceful as it was controversial. By calling out Xi, Putin, and Kim in the same breath, he framed the parade not as a routine show of force but as evidence of a hostile coalition conspiring against America. His choice of words, conspiring against us, was deliberate, drawing a sharp line between the United States and what he depicted as an axis of authoritarian powers. The phrase was instantly quotable, repeated across television panels, podcasts, and social media feeds. It captured attention precisely because it was simple, visceral, and accusatory. In contrast, President Joe Biden and his administration chose restraint. Secretary of State Antony Blinken described the parade as concerning but unsurprising, while emphasizing America's ongoing commitment to alliances in the Pacific and Europe. The Pentagon released a measured statement reminding the public that while China's military advancements were notable, the U.S. nuclear arsenal and its network of bases worldwide remained unmatched. For Biden, the goal was clear: avoid escalating rhetoric while maintaining a steady message of confidence. Yet Trump's blunt framing resonated with millions of Americans who already felt the country was under siege, economically, militarily, and culturally. For them, the image of Xi, Putin, and Kim seated side by side was not just a foreign affair, it was a confirmation of their fears. Talk radio hosts and conservative commentators seized on the conspiracy angle, arguing that America's enemies were openly plotting its downfall while the Biden administration remained passive. In rallies that followed, Trump doubled down. He told crowds that under his leadership, China would never have dared to flaunt weapons capable of hitting U.S. soil. He reminded supporters of his meetings with Kim Jong-un and his tariffs on Chinese goods, painting himself as the only leader willing to confront America's adversaries head-on. His narrative was not just about foreign policy, it was about strength versus weakness, decisiveness versus timidity. Meanwhile, Democratic leaders accused Trump of irresponsibility. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer warned that Trump's rhetoric risked inflaming already tense relations, while House Speaker Hakeem Jeffries argued that the real path to security lay in diplomacy and coalition building. But even as Democrats pushed back, the political ground was shifting. Trump's message was simple, and simplicity has power. For many voters, the parade was no longer just about China, it was about whether America had leaders strong enough to defend it. Outside the U.S., global reactions varied. In Europe, NATO officials expressed concern over China's growing alignment with Russia, especially given Moscow's ongoing war in Ukraine. The image of Putin sitting comfortably beside Xi was particularly unsettling to Eastern European states like Poland and Lithuania, who saw it as confirmation of a deepening authoritarian bloc. For these nations, Trump's rhetoric, however controversial, resonated with their own fears. Japan and South Korea voiced alarm over the missile capabilities showcased in Beijing, but they also stressed the importance of maintaining communication with China to avoid accidental escalation. Taiwan, unsurprisingly, saw the parade as a direct threat, with Taiwanese officials warning that the weapons on display were designed with them in mind. In India, commentary split between admiration for China's technological progress and concern over Beijing's growing assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific. What united much of the global response, however, was unease about what the parade symbolized. Not just Chinese strength, but a willingness to openly display coordination with Russia and North Korea. Even if there was no formal alliance, the optics suggested an informal bloc, one that could challenge U.S. leadership in ways not seen since the Cold War. Back in Washington, intelligence agencies began analyzing the parade in granular detail. The CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency (DIA) assessed which of the weapons were likely operational, which were prototypes, and which might be exaggerated. Early reports suggested that while some of the hypersonic systems were still in development, others were already deployable. The DF-61 in particular was confirmed to be functional, with ranges sufficient to target every major American city. For the intelligence community, the challenge was not just determining what was real, but predicting how China might use these capabilities to alter strategic calculations. Trump, however, didn't wait for classified reports. In speeches, he insisted that the threat was already here and demanded immediate action. Stronger sanctions, expanded missile defense, and a reinvestment in America's nuclear arsenal. He called Biden asleep at the wheel, accusing him of prioritizing climate agreements and diplomacy while enemies sharpened their knives. For Trump, the parade was proof that America was under attack, not by missiles yet but by a coordinated strategy of intimidation. This narrative began to influence public opinion. Polls conducted 2 weeks after the parade showed a sharp increase in the number of Americans who viewed China as the greatest threat to U.S. security. For years, that position had been held by terrorism or, more recently, Russia. But now China was seen as the central adversary. Meanwhile, within the Republican Party, Trump's framing created both unity and division. Hawks like Senator Tom Cotton and Representative Mike Gallagher echoed his warnings, urging Congress to boost defense spending and accelerate missile defense programs. Others worried that Trump's approach risked cornering the U.S. into unnecessary confrontation. Yet even critics acknowledged that his ability to shape the national conversation was unrivaled. Fathers watching the news after long workdays, veterans recalling their service overseas, and young professionals scrolling through social media all encountered the same image: Xi, Putin, and Kim together, missiles looming in the background. Trump's phrase, "conspiring against us," was easy to repeat, easy to believe, and hard to ignore. But beneath the noise, a deeper question was forming. Was this truly a conspiracy against America, or was it theater meant to project power without actual coordination? Could three leaders with very different interests, China focused on economic dominance, Russia bogged down in Ukraine, and North Korea obsessed with regime survival, really work together in a sustained alliance? Analysts debated endlessly, but Trump's narrative didn't require nuance. For him, the answer was already settled. Yes, they were conspiring, and yes, America was at risk. By the end of the month, the parade had evolved from a sin to believe Trump's interpretation was to believe America needed stronger, more aggressive leadership. To dismiss it was to side with diplomacy and restraint. Either way, the spectacle in Beijing had accomplished something remarkable. It had shifted not just military calculations but the very framework of American politics. The streets of Beijing had been filled with soldiers and missiles, but the real battlefield was now in Washington, where narratives collided and futures were being shaped. The images of Beijing's parade had already reshaped political discourse in America, but inside the Pentagon and among military planners, the response was far more technical, urgent, and pragmatic. Behind closed doors, generals and analysts pored over satellite footage, dissecting the dimensions of launchers, the heat signatures of engines, and the configurations of missile canisters. For them, Trump's fiery rhetoric might have been political theater, but the underlying question was deadly serious. How should America respond to the reality that China had now displayed weapons capable of reaching the U.S. mainland? The first step was re-examining America's missile defense architecture. For decades, the United States had relied on a layered system: ground-based interceptors in Alaska and California designed to knock out intercontinental ballistic missiles, Aegis-equipped naval destroyers patrolling the Pacific, and THAAD systems deployed in South Korea and Guam. These were formidable, but hypersonic glide vehicles like the ones China unveiled threatened to render them obsolete. Unlike traditional ballistic missiles, which follow predictable trajectories, hypersonics could maneuver mid-flight, slipping past existing defenses. Within the military establishment, this sparked a grim realization: the homeland was no longer invulnerable. For years, Americans had lived under the assumption that wars would be fought abroad, that oceans were protective barriers, and that missile defense provided an impenetrable shield. But the DF-61 and its hypersonic cousins shattered that illusion. Suddenly, scenarios once relegated to think tanks, Chinese missiles striking Los Angeles, New York, or Washington, were part of serious war games. Trump seized on this vulnerability. At rallies, he hammered home the idea that under Biden, America was exposed. "We have missiles pointed at us, ladies and gentlemen," he told one roaring crowd, his voice rising. "And what is Joe Biden doing? Sleeping. The world is laughing at us while they conspire against us." His words struck a chord, particularly with veterans and working-class men who felt America's strength slipping away. To them, Trump's defiance wasn't just rhetoric, it was reassurance that someone was willing to take the threat seriously. Meanwhile, U.S. allies watched anxiously. In Japan, debates erupted over whether the country should double its defense budget and acquire counterstrike capabilities against Chinese launch sites. South Korea, already under the shadow of North Korean artillery and missiles, faced new pressure to integrate more deeply with American defense systems. Australia, part of the AUKUS Pact, accelerated its plans to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. Across the Indo-Pacific, governments were recalculating their strategies, aware that China's display wasn't just about Taiwan, it was about reshaping the balance of power across the entire region. In Europe, the response was complicated by the war in Ukraine. For NATO, the parade raised fears that China's growing alignment with Russia could create a two-front challenge: Moscow pressuring Europe while Beijing threatened the Pacific. Eastern European states like Poland urged Washington to stand firm, while Western capitals, wary of escalation, preferred diplomacy. Yet the sight of Putin seated proudly beside Xi at the parade made it harder to dismiss Trump's framing of an emerging authoritarian axis. Inside Washington, debates intensified. The Biden administration prioritized steady reassurance, bolstering alliances, maintaining deterrence, and avoiding panic. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin announced plans to expand investments in hypersonic defense, laser systems, and space-based tracking networks. The message was clear: America would adapt. But Trump painted this as too little, too late. "They're playing catch-up while China is sprinting ahead," he thundered at another rally. "When I was president, they didn't dare. Now they're showing off missiles that can wipe out our cities." Trump's strategy wasn't just about stoking fear, it was about casting himself as the indispensable protector. His campaign ads juxtaposed footage of Beijing's parade with clips of him standing with military leaders, signing executive orders, or confronting foreign leaders. The implication was unmistakable: under Trump, America was respected and feared; under Biden, it was mocked and endangered. At the same time, Trump's accusations of conspiracy gained traction internationally. Chinese state media dismissed his comments as paranoid, insisting the parade was purely commemorative. Russian outlets, however, gleefully amplified his remarks, framing them as evidence of American panic. North Korea, never one to miss an opportunity for bombast, declared that the U.S. was rightfully terrified of the friendship between Pyongyang, Moscow, and Beijing. In their own ways, America's adversaries played into Trump's narrative by leaning into the idea of coordination, even if the reality was more symbolic than strategic. But was there really a conspiracy? Analysts cautioned against oversimplification. China and Russia had overlapping interests, yes, but also deep mistrust. North Korea depended on Beijing but was often unpredictable. What bound them together was less a grand plan than a shared desire to weaken U.S. influence. Still, optics mattered, and in politics, perception often becomes reality. Trump's genius, or recklessness depending on one's view, was in collapsing the nuance into a single powerful phrase: "They are conspiring against us." The psychological effect of this was profound. For ordinary Americans, the idea of a united front of adversaries stirred memories of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union posed an existential threat. But unlike then, the threat now was more diffuse. Not just missiles but cyber attacks, economic competition, and influence campaigns. Trump capitalized on this uncertainty, presenting himself as a man who could cut through complexity with clarity. Meanwhile, military planners knew that clarity was harder to come by. They drafted scenarios for how China might use its new arsenal, not necessarily to strike the U.S. directly, but to deter intervention in Taiwan. If Beijing could credibly threaten American cities, would Washington hesitate to defend Taipei? That was the chilling calculation behind the DF-61's unveiling. It wasn't about firing the missile, it was about making America think. By midsummer, polls showed that national security was climbing the list of voter priorities, second only to the economy. The conspiracy narrative had taken hold, amplified by conservative media and reinforced by China's own assertive rhetoric. What began as a military parade had become the foundation of a new campaign strategy, one that pitted Trump's vision of muscular nationalism against Biden's call for steady diplomacy. In Beijing, the missiles had long been rolled back into storage. The soldiers had gone home. The banners had been folded. But in Washington, the reverberations continued. For the U.S. military, the challenge was technological. For politicians, it was ideological. For Trump, it was personal, a chance to reclaim his image as the only man strong enough to defend the nation. The stage was set for a climax, not just in the unfolding rivalry between China and the U.S., but in the looming political showdown within America itself. The question was no longer whether Beijing had sent a message. It was how America, under leaders divided by vision and philosophy, would respond. As summer drew on, the aftershocks of Beijing's parade refused to fade. What had begun as a show of strength abroad had become the heartbeat of political discourse in America. Everywhere, from television debates to coffee shops, from military think tanks to campaign rallies, the same question pulsed. Were Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong truly conspiring against the United States? Or had Trump's words transformed a moment of symbolism into a looming crisis? In Washington, President Biden worked to project calm authority. His team emphasized the resilience of American alliances, the superiority of U.S. nuclear forces, and the strength of the dollar as a weapon in its own right. Yet despite these reassurances, polls revealed a growing unease. A majority of Americans now viewed China as the nation's top adversary, and a significant percentage believed that Beijing, Moscow, and Pyongyang were indeed coordinating their moves. The optics of that parade, the missiles, the tanks, the grinning strongmen, were too vivid to be forgotten. For Trump, this was fertile ground. At rally after rally, he sharpened his message, repeating the words that had electrified his base: "They are conspiring against us." He painted himself as the only leader with the willpower to confront the danger. Biden, he said, was a weak man presiding over a weak America. He promised a future of renewed military might, reindustrialization, and ironclad nationalism. His words had the cadence of both warning and prophecy. If America failed to act now, it would face humiliation later. Meanwhile, in Beijing, Xi Jinping capitalized on the spectacle's momentum. State-run media portrayed the parade as a moment of national unity, a declaration that China was no longer the sleeping dragon, but a force capable of challenging Western dominance. Putin, for his part, used the imagery to bolster his own propaganda, telling Russians that they were not isolated but part of a rising coalition. Kim Jong reveled in the attention, his regime using the images of him beside Xi and Putin to project legitimacy at home. Whether or not the three truly trusted each other was irrelevant. The perception of unity was powerful enough. The Pentagon, however, wasn't dealing in perceptions. War games intensified, with new scenarios playing out in simulation halls. One involved a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, supported by Russian cyber attacks on U.S. infrastructure and North Korean missile tests as a distraction. Another explored a crisis in the South China Sea, where Chinese hypersonic weapons deterred American carriers from entering contested waters. Each simulation ended with sobering conclusions. America could still prevail, but at staggering costs. The very notion of the homeland being vulnerable changed the calculus of every move. Trump used these vulnerabilities to hammer home his case. At a rally in Ohio, he thundered, "When I was in the White House, they didn't dare roll out missiles that could hit our cities. They didn't dare sit there, shoulder to shoulder, laughing at America. They didn't dare. Why? Because we were strong. Because they knew I would respond." The crowd roared, chanting his name. For his supporters, this was not just politics, it was survival. In the media, analysts debated endlessly. Some warned that Trump's rhetoric risked a spiral of escalation, where words turned into actions and deterrence gave way to confrontation. Others argued that his bluntness was exactly what was needed to wake America from complacency. Biden's defenders pointed to his steady diplomacy, his quiet strengthening of alliances in Asia and Europe, and his careful avoidance of reckless escalation. But in the realm of public imagination, Trump's clarity often cut deeper than Biden's caution. Internationally, the divide sharpened. NATO allies leaned more heavily into American leadership, aware that without Washington's umbrella, their own security was fragile. In Asia, governments hedged, deepening ties with the US while avoiding moves that might provoke China. For many nations, the question was no longer whether to choose sides but how long they could postpone the inevitable. The world was drifting toward blocs, not because of treaties but because of perception, fear, and power. And then came the moment that crystallized everything. A Chinese naval exercise near Taiwan in which hypersonic missiles were fired into the sea, landing just 200 miles from the island's coast. It was not an attack, but it was close enough to send shockwaves through every capital. Taiwan scrambled jets, Japan went on alert, and the US deployed additional carrier groups to the Pacific. The exercise was Beijing's way of testing the waters. How far could they go before America blinked? Trump pounced. "They're not just conspiring," he declared at a rally that very night. "They're practicing. Practicing for the day they move on Taiwan or worse. Practicing for the day they think America won't fight back. But under Trump, America will fight back." His words thundered across the political landscape, cutting through policy briefings and expert analysis. For his audience, the threat felt immediate and the solution was simple: strength. In Washington, Biden responded with firmness, ordering U.S. forces to conduct freedom of navigation operations through the Taiwan Strait and reaffirming commitments to allies. Yet even as the administration moved decisively, Trump's narrative had already claimed the emotional high ground. He was no longer just reacting to China's parade. He was defining America's response to the entire unfolding drama. By autumn, the political season was in full swing. The Beijing parade, months past, remained a central talking point, a prism through which voters interpreted foreign policy, leadership, and America's place in the world. Trump's phrase, "They are conspiring against us," had become more than rhetoric. It was a lens shaping how millions saw the world, not as a series of isolated challenges, but as a united front of adversaries. The climax of the script was not in Beijing, nor in Washington, but in the minds of the American people. A military parade had transformed into a political battlefield, a contest over strength and weakness, clarity and caution, confrontation and diplomacy. Xi's missiles had rolled past the reviewing stand for a few minutes in Tiananmen Square, but their shadows stretched all the way to America's heartland. Trump's voice, echoing in arenas packed with supporters, carried a simple, chilling promise: they may conspire. They may plot. They may build their missiles and their armies. But as long as America stands strong, they will never win. The crowd erupted. For his followers, the message was clear. For his critics, it was dangerous. For the world, it was a sign that the storm clouds of a new era were gathering. And so, as the year closed, the question remained unresolved. Were Beijing, Moscow, and Pyongyang truly conspiring against the United States, or had Trump's words turned perception into reality? Perhaps the truth lay somewhere in between. But one fact was undeniable: the parade had changed the conversation, and in doing so, had changed history. The missiles were silent, but the world was not. The next chapter of geopolitics had already begun.